Ticketing looks clean on paper. You get the numbers, the queues, the dashboards. But in reality, that model only measures pain after the system has already failed. The expensive part of the problem usually starts much earlier. It starts when an employee loses 10 minutes, then 20, then eventually just gives up. They retry, they ask a coworker, they miss the meeting or share the wrong file because the right path stopped working. And that's the part most support teams still don't see. The best internal support model today isn't about faster triage. It's about removing the need for triage entirely. Imagine an autonomous agent inside Microsoft 365 that watches context, spots friction early, and acts before a person ever thinks about opening a portal. In this episode, I want to show you why the help desk model breaks, what actually replaces it, and how you can govern it without creating chaos. If this shift matters to your work, subscribe to M365 FM, because one level deeper, the real problem isn't the queue, it's the model behind it. The death of the ticket. The old support flow is still everywhere. Something breaks, a user notices it, the user tries to explain it, then IT translates that explanation into a category, a priority, and maybe an assignment group. The issue enters a queue. Someone triages it, someone else asks for more detail. Another team gets involved. Time keeps moving while the actual work stays stuck. That process feels normal because it's familiar, but familiar and effective are not the same thing. A ticket is not support. A ticket is evidence that support arrived late. By the time a ticket even exists, the employee has already hit friction and lost their context. They've already switched their attention away from the work they were trying to do. The queue isn't the service, the queue is a record of failure. In large Microsoft 365 estates, manual triage becomes the real choke point. This doesn't happen because support teams are lazy. It happens because humans are being asked to do something that no longer fits the scale of the environment. You have more users, more devices, more apps, more policies. You have more edge cases crossing Teams, SharePoint, Exchange, Intune, and Entra at the exact same time. The volume doesn't just grow, the combinations grow. That's where the old model breaks. Most teams respond by adding more structure. They build another portal, another bot, or another routing rule. But in reality, that just adds one more layer between the employee and the resolution. The system is still waiting for the user to notice the problem, describe the problem, and ask for help in the right way. Work doesn't start in a support portal, it starts in Teams, it starts in Outlook, it starts in a document someone needs right now, or a meeting that begins in 30 seconds. That's where support demand actually begins, and the ticketing model is completely detached from that moment. The hidden cost is much bigger than your queue report shows. People context switch, duplicate incidents pile up under different labels. Knowledge articles go stale. Analysts spend their entire day sorting, routing, and clarifying instead of actually fixing things. The time to resolution stretches out because every handoff adds a delay, and every delay strips away the original context. Research on agentic AI and IT operations points to the same structural issue. At least 80% of effort is still trapped in reactive ITIL-style work. That number matters because it tells you exactly where the labor is going. It isn't going into resilience or prevention, it's going into reaction. Once you see that, the ticket starts to look less like an operating model and more like a symptom. It's a symptom of a system that only responds after the damage is visible. So the next question isn't how to process tickets faster, it's what the system should do before a ticket is ever needed. The invisible employee model. So what actually replaces the ticket? It isn't just another chatbot sitting on top of the same mess, and it certainly isn't a prettier front door to the same old queue. The shift goes much deeper than that because the invisible employee is an operational worker living inside your Microsoft 365 environment. This agent has its own identity, a defined scope of work, memory of what it did yesterday, and strict rules about what it can and cannot touch. That distinction matters. A chatbot waits for you to type a prompt, but an invisible employee watches for conditions to change. It starts from context instead of starting from a conversation. Because it can see sign-in states, device health, license status, and how files are being shared, it doesn't have to wait for friction to appear. Instead of asking how it can help after something breaks, it constantly asks a different question in the background. What is drifting away from the state this employee needs to do their job right now? That is where things change. The model is embedded directly inside the work itself. When someone joins a meeting and the audio routing fails, or a guest cannot open a file they were just sent, the old world creates a report and a handoff. In the new model, the agent sees the pattern immediately, checks if the condition matches a known issue, and takes the next safe action to fix it. Maybe it resets a path or triggers a policy check, or perhaps it reroutes a request and prompts for MFA before documenting the fix. The point is simple. The first response no longer requires a human to read a vague description and guess what happened. This feels invisible when it works well because there is no waiting room and no "please select a category" form to fill out. Support shows up as restored flow. The employee just gets back to work, and in many cases, they never even see the machinery running behind the scenes. You can already see how this changes your staffing logic. The old model hires people to absorb volume, sort through requests, and clean up broken context between different teams. The new model needs fewer people doing triage and more people designing guardrails, defining desired states, and supervising how these agents behave over time. Humans stay in the system, but the entire shape of their daily work shifts. Research on agentic AI in support keeps pointing in this direction. Routine support can move toward exception-based handling, which creates massive efficiency gains when the environment and policies are well bounded. That last part is vital because this is not magic. If your data is weak or your process is messy, the agent will not become smart just because you decided to call it autonomous. This all clicked for me when I stopped thinking about the agent as a software feature and started viewing it as a non-human employee with a badge. A real worker needs an identity, a job description, permissions, and a manager to report to. The agent needs those exact same things because the value comes from reliable action inside a system, not from clever language in a chat window. The invisible employee is not a UI trick. It is a new support layer that watches for friction across the Microsoft 365 estate, acts within policy, and pushes human attention up to the exceptions that actually need judgment. Once that model is clear, the next question gets very practical. How does preemption actually work? The architecture of preemption. So how does preemption actually work inside Microsoft 365? The shift moves from request and response to event reasoning and orchestration. That sounds technical, but the model is simple once you break it apart. First, something in the environment changes, then the system interprets if that change means risk or drift. And finally, it takes the approved action using the tools already in your stack. Start with the event layer. Microsoft 365 already produces signals everywhere, which means Entra sees sign-in behavior while Intune tracks device posture and compliance. Defender watches for suspicious activity, and Teams shows you exactly when a meeting fails or call quality drops. SharePoint and Exchange expose access patterns and content activity, while service health signals tell you when the platform itself is the problem. When you add user actions on top of that, you have a constant stream of context. Most organizations collect those signals, but very few actually use them as a support system. Raw events alone do not help because they need a reasoning layer to make sense of the noise. This is where the invisible employee stops being automation theater and starts acting like a real operator. The agent looks at the signal, compares the current state against the desired state, and decides what class of action is safe to take. A meeting audio issue is not the same as a risky sign-in, and a broken sharing link is different from a license mismatch. The agent has to classify the problem first because taking action without classification just creates mistakes faster. Then comes orchestration. Once the agent understands the issue, it can use the right mechanism to respond. That might be Power Automate for workflows, Copilot Studio for logic, or Microsoft Graph for system actions and context. The tools matter, but the bigger point is how they connect to one another. You are not building one smart prompt, but rather a chain that can detect, decide, act, and verify. That last part gets missed all the time. A self-correcting system does not stop once the action is taken. It runs a loop where it detects the issue, tests the condition, applies the fix, and verifies the result before recording what happened. Research on self-correcting logic makes it clear that these systems work through feedback and correction patterns, rather than one isolated answer from a language model. If the first action fails, the system needs a way to assess why, so it can revise the next step while staying inside defined limits. You can picture this clearly in a few Microsoft 365 cases. When a user gets blocked because their license and policy scope do not match, the agent detects the mismatch and checks the intended role profile. It applies the allowed correction, confirms the user has access, and logs the change without anyone having to ask. If a risky sign-in appears in Entra, the agent sees the risk event and checks your conditional access rules immediately. It prompts for stronger verification or blocks access based on your policy, then records the outcome for a human to review later. When a stale sharing link keeps failing in SharePoint, the agent compares the current permission path with the expected sharing rules. It replaces the broken route with the approved one and sends the corrected link in context, which closes the loop before a desk analyst ever has to read a ticket titled Access Issue Urgent. Meeting support is another great example. If a room device fails or a joining path breaks seconds before a call starts, the agent can detect the condition and validate the fault. It tries a low-risk recovery step and notifies the organizer in Teams with a status update right where the work is happening. That communication layer is a massive part of the design. Support has to live where the interruption happens. If your work happens in Teams, Outlook, and the M365 workspace, then support should answer you there too. You shouldn't have to drag the user somewhere else when you can meet the event in context. None of this means full autonomy across every single task because that would be reckless. Low-risk actions can run automatically, but high-impact changes still need approval from a person. That approval path has to be part of the architecture from the start rather than being bolted on later. The agent should know when to act, when to ask, and exactly when to stop. And once you build that into the flow, the conversation stops being about automation features. It becomes about control, governance, trust, and agent identity. When support starts acting on its own, a difficult question surfaces immediately. Who is actually doing the work? If that answer is vague, the entire model falls apart. An agent cannot exist in your environment as some fuzzy helper with broad access and no clear owner. It needs a real identity in Entra. It needs a named owner, a defined scope, and a life cycle that starts and ends for a specific reason. If that agent can read data, trigger workflows, or message your users, you have to govern it like an active participant in the tenant. You cannot treat it like a feature someone turned on and then forgot about. This is why agent identity is so critical to the system. You need to know exactly what the agent is, which systems it can touch, and who gets the call when things start to drift. Least privilege has to be the baseline here. You can't settle for broad convenience or tell yourself you will tighten the permissions later. Because the blast radius of a support agent depends entirely on its permissions, designing those permissions is a core part of designing support. Agent 365 serves as a necessary control layer in this setup because it brings the entire agent estate into clear view. It provides the registry, the approval workflows, and the policy templates that keep things running safely. While those pieces might sound like administrative chores, they solve a massive structural problem. Most organizations don't struggle because they lack AI features, but because they cannot see or control what is already running in their environment. The research on this point is blunt. Only a small minority of large enterprises can fully inventory every agent currently running in their system. Before leaders start talking about scaling autonomous support, they have to answer a much simpler question. Do we even know which agents exist and what they are doing right now? Oversight also has to match the level of risk involved. A personal productivity agent working in a narrow lane is one thing, but a collaborative agent touching shared content is something else entirely. Then you have enterprise agents taking action across sensitive workflows, which sits in a different category of risk. This is why the risk zone model, personal, collaborative, and enterprise, matters so much. Your control model should rise alongside the possible impact. If you treat every agent the same, low-risk work gets buried in slow approvals, while high-risk work slips through with weak scrutiny. At a minimum, your control stack in Microsoft 365 should look familiar to your team. You use identity in Entra, data boundaries through Purview, and monitoring through Defender. You apply access conditions through conditional access and ensure auditability is baked in from the start. You need to be able to reconstruct exactly what happened without having to guess after an incident occurs. Human oversight needs to be designed into the logic rather than improvised during a crisis. High-impact actions should always pause for a human signature. Reasoning should be logged in a form that people can actually inspect and understand. You need rollback paths to exist before the very first autonomous action goes live. If an agent updates access or changes a routing policy, someone must have a way to trace that decision and undo it cleanly. There's another factor leaders often miss because the early demos look so good: the cost of rework. If an agent creates cleanup loops for your team, the projected savings disappear instantly. This is the rework tax. It is the time spent correcting bad output, reversing wrong actions, or chasing down unintended side effects. If your team saves 10 minutes on execution but burns 8 minutes cleaning up the mess, you didn't actually automate support. You just moved the friction to a different part of the process. Trust does not come from a polished policy deck or a big launch announcement. It comes from runtime evidence. People need to see what the agent saw, what it decided, and what actually changed in the system. That is how you build trust in autonomous support. The proof has to sit in the behavior of the tool rather than the branding of the project. Once that governance foundation is solid, the conversation can finally move away from security jargon and into executive language. What does this actually change for the bottom line? The new ROI of invisible support. Once leaders accept the control model, the financial questions start to shift. In the old model, support value is measured by visible work like tickets closed, calls handled, and SLA performance. Those numbers still matter, but they only describe a reaction to a problem. They don't tell you how much interruption never reached the queue or how much employee time stayed intact because a problem was killed early. That is the core accounting problem. Invisible support creates value through absence. You see the value when there is no ticket, no escalation, and no analyst spending 20 minutes reconstructing a problem from half-complete notes. If you only measure the visible effort of the support team, you miss the outcome you actually wanted. You wanted stable work with fewer interruptions? Ticket volume is a weak signal when it stands on its own. A drop in tickets might mean demand fell, but it could also mean the environment got healthier and the support layer got smarter. Those are two very different stories. Executives need a KPI set that can tell the difference between them. You should start by looking at the autonomous resolution rate. This isn't about how many conversations the bot had, but how many support events were resolved end-to-end without a human ever touching them. You also need to track the reduction in mean time to resolution. In AI-driven environments, diagnosis-heavy flows often see improvements in the 40 to 60% range. Then you can look at the cost per resolution and the user productivity you've regained. That last metric is easy to skip because it doesn't sit neatly in a standard service desk report. However, that is often where the real value lives. A person who is blocked for 15 minutes before they even open a ticket has already created a cost for the company. When you multiply that by meeting interruptions and access friction across a large tenant, the hidden loss is much bigger than the queue suggests. This is why the cost of inaction model is so important for the business case. You calculate the hours spent on manual effort before formal support even begins. Then you add the cost of errors and repeated work. Suddenly, the argument for preemption stops sounding like a theory. You aren't just funding a futuristic support layer, you are removing a tax that has been sitting inside your daily work for years. The economics of the narrow case make this even clearer. Research on agentic IT support puts human handling at about $8.75 per issue. In contrast, narrow agentic handling can fall below 50 cents per issue once the system is developed. This doesn't mean every support action will be that cheap, and leaders should be careful with broad averages. Telemetry quality and governance will always affect the final cost, but the direction of the trend is unmistakable. This is the moment where IT moves out of the old cost center story. It isn't because support disappears, but because support turns into a reliability layer that protects employee throughput in the background. The business feels this as smoother work rather than a dramatic support event. You get fewer interruptions, faster restoration, and less labor wasted on routing and clarification. Still, bad measurement can easily fake progress. If your telemetry is weak, the agent might just summarize a failure faster instead of actually preventing it. If rework stays off the dashboard, the ROI will look much cleaner than it really is. If reclaimed time just leaks back into low-value activity, leaders will overstate the gain. The financial case must stay grounded in hard evidence like prevented incidents and lower manual touches. You have to measure the time truly returned to useful work. Once you measure that properly, the support function stops looking like overhead that needs to be cut. It starts looking like operating capacity that the business finally gets back. What this does to the support team, think about what this actually does to the team on the ground, because this shift isn't really about cutting headcount, it's about changing what your people actually do with their day. In the old setup, most of your support capacity gets eaten up by password resets, ticket routing, and endless clarification loops. You have people chasing updates and moving data between systems that were never designed to talk to each other. None of that work makes the environment more stable, it just keeps the queue from overflowing. When agents take over that predictable routine work, human effort finally moves up a level. Support engineers start spending their time defining what a healthy state looks like and tuning the logic behind approvals. They focus on improving knowledge sources, testing how policies behave, and making sure the agent stays within the boundaries it was given. That is a completely different job from staring at subject lines all day and trying to guess what a user actually wants. This is exactly where most deployments stall out. Organizations try to keep their old broken processes and just drop an agent on top while expecting a better result. But the process is still reactive, the handoffs are still messy, and the underlying knowledge is still weak. The agent just becomes another layer of paint on a crumbling wall. It might answer a question faster, but it can't fix a support model that was built around delay. The better way is to redesign the work first. You have to decide which tasks stay human, because they require judgment or sensitive communication. Then you decide which work moves into autonomous flows, because the outcome is predictable and the actions are safe. This division is vital because support teams aren't going away. They are just becoming the people who design the controls and handle the exceptions. That means the way we train people has to change too. Teams need to learn how to oversee a system rather than just executing a manual task. They need to understand rollback logic, audit reviews, and how to test an agent before it goes live. They also have to be able to spot when a model is failing, because an automated bad workflow is still a bad workflow. It just breaks things faster. If you are hiring for this future, you probably don't need another generalist to triage tickets. You need someone who can orchestrate flows across the Microsoft 365 stack and define the controls that keep agents in check. You want people who can improve the environment so that support demand actually drops instead of just stacking up. So how do you actually start this without it turning into a massive multi-year transformation project? The best move is to pick one single flow that causes constant friction inside your Microsoft 365 environment. Access remediation is usually a great candidate, but you could also look at meeting support or device compliance handoffs. It doesn't matter which one you choose, as long as the pattern happens often and you know exactly what the successful outcome should look like. Once you have the target, you have to define the basics with real discipline. You need to know what healthy looks like and which specific events tell you that things are drifting off track. Decide which actions are safe to automate and exactly where the human escalation needs to begin. Before you let anything go live, make sure you have a baseline for your ticket counts, manual touches, and how long users are currently waiting for a fix. You also have to put your governance in place on day one. Give the agent a specific identity, assign a human owner to it, and set clear approval rules. Every single action the agent takes needs to be logged. You should also have a plan for when that agent gets retired or reassigned, so it doesn't just become ghost automation. When that first flow starts working, your entire operating model begins to shift. Support stops acting like a front desk that just reacts to problems. Instead, it starts behaving like a reliability engine that is built directly into the system. Support is shifting from a visible reaction to embedded prevention. The ticket was never the service. It was proof the service showed up too late. Pick one support flow this quarter and redesign it for preemption instead of response. If you want more on M365, Copilot, Azure, security, and AI operating models, subscribe to M365 FM and leave a review. Connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn with the next topic you want unpacked.